Hello and welcome back to the series Masters of the Chessboard. In this series we're going through the famous book by Richard Reti, looking at each of the games in that book one at a time and Reti's analysis of those games. We're continuing to look at the games of Aron Nimzowitsch. In this instance, Nimzowitsch has the black pieces and his opponent is Richard Teichmann, who has the white pieces. Now it starts off with a bit of discussion about the Philidor defense. So knight f3 and then d6. So usually we'd see knight c6, but d6 and then d4. And we've talked about this quite a bit in some of the games of Lasker in terms of the Steinitz defense to the Spanish. So let's just play a few more moves. So this will be sort of the Steinitz variation of the Spanish game, of the Ruy Lopez. So we've talked about this opening quite a bit, and we've said about how white is black is forced to take here because otherwise they'll lose a pawn. They have no way to save the pawn, and we looked at this in one of the Lasker games, and if they do take, then we have this pawn structure with e4 and d6, and this is quite beneficial for white. And because of that, Reti starts off talking about the Philidor defense, and straight away we see d4. And he starts off talking about it and saying that in the Steinitz defense to the Ruy Lopez, the issue is that black is forced to take, otherwise they'll lose a pawn through a longer variation. However, there was an American player by the name of Hanam who came up with this knight to d7, and this has the advantage over the Steinitz defense to Ruy Lopez in that the center can be maintained. Black is able to defend their pawns; it doesn't have to exchange. That's the main idea of it. However, this knight on d7 is placed quite awkwardly. You want your knight on c6, really. The knight being on d7 is necessary for this defense, though. And because of this knight, black has to play sort of passively. So the game might continue to something like bishop c4, and here black must play c6. And Reti comments that there are some complications if black doesn't do this. c6 has the advantage of preparing b4 and preparing b5 and also preparing d5. If they were to not play b3, let's say they were to play knight f3, then knight to g5 would come. So obviously creating this a double attack on the f7 pawn. And the variation given is d5, e takes d5, and then h6. But then after knight f3, white is just simply a pawn up. This pawn is obviously defended, and white just a pawn up. Likewise, if instead of c6, black played bishop b7, then we'd see d takes e5, and now black's in a bit of a pickle. If they take on e5, then we'd see queen to d5, double attacking this pawn here. And the only way to stop mate is to play knight h6, in which case bishop takes h6, and now again the only way to stop mate is to castle. And so white will just be a full knight up. Alternatively, after bishop b7, d takes e5, if knight takes e5, then again we could have knight takes e5, d takes e5, and then queen to h5, creating a double attack on this f7 pawn and threatening mate. The only way to stop mate really is g6. Well, not quite threatening mate, but you don't particularly want anyone to take there. But then after you take here, knight f6, again, white is just a clean pawn up. So that's why in this position c6 is forced. And this is the Philidor defense, the Hanam variation. And the idea is that it's a very solid defense. Black gets a very solid center, except they're going to play quite passively. Now in the game, we saw e4, e5, Nh3, d6, d4, and then we see knight f6 in the game. And this move is played by Nimzowitsch because it counterattacks the e4 pawn, and this counterattack avoids a lot of the different traps that are possible. For instance, if d takes e5, then knight takes e4 could occur, and after something like bishop c4, c6, neither side really has a huge advantage. c6 prevents queen d5, and it also prepares a potential b5 push. So in the game we see knight c3, and now knight b to d7, bishop to c4. So we're going into the exact same position we just looked at, only via a different move order. Bishop to e7, and short castles. Reti comments that you could try and go for some tactics here. Bishop takes f7, but this is quite premature. So after king takes f7, knight g5 check, king g8. The idea is that after you go to here, the queen's got one square they can go to. So queen e8, knight takes c7. The knight is obviously forking, so the queen moves. Knight takes a8, and it looks like white's up. They might struggle to get this knight out, but white. But afterwards, white would almost be up. However, after queen takes g2, rook f1, black's going to have quite a strong attack. So something like e takes d4 is possible, and then after knight d5, you could have something like queen takes e4. Or there's quite a lot of different options here for black, and there's quite a lot of different traps. Queen takes d4 is the only real option here, but then after knight e5, black's attack is coming pretty fast, and white's going to struggle to hold this. Like straight away, they're threatening to win the queen, and something like bishop h3 could come, threatening the rook. White's really going to struggle to hold this. Black's attack is going to come very fast. The computer evaluates it as minus 0.7, so it's not totally lost, but black's going to have a hard time defending. So that was after bishop takes f7, king f7, and knight to here, intending the forks. However, if instead of bishop takes f7, Reti also gives an option of playing knight to g5 first. And the idea is after castles, bishop takes f7, rook takes f7. You can then get a similar idea with knight to e6. Again, the queen has one safe square, e8, and then knight takes c7. And queen d8, knight takes a8. Now the main line here would normally go something like b5, but the variation Reti gives is b6, and then something like knight to b5 might come, trying to get the knight back out. There's quite a lot of different options open to black here. But I believe this line ends up in a draw. I think if you play accurately, it just ends up in a complete draw. Because white wants to try and get this knight out to safety, and they will just end up having a draw at the end of it. So white doesn't go for this knight g5 line or this bishop takes f7 line. Instead, they just castle, which is the best option, really. Black castles as well. And now we see queen e2, c6, and now bishop to g5. And Reti comments that this move is a mistake. So the Reti comments that in this variation of the Philidor, if we compare it to some of the versions of the Steinitz, in some of Steinetz's games, we saw Steinitz with, especially the white pieces, would often have his pawns on e4, d3, and c3. Very similar to how here black has pawns on e5, d6, and c6. It's almost a similar pattern. This would be Steinitz's layout of his pawns, just like this is black's layout of the pawns. It would be almost the same, except when Steinitz played it, his bishop would be out either on b5 or on c4, so his bishop would be outside of the pawn chain. However, here, in this instance, black's bishop is on e7, so black's bishop is on the inside of the pawn chain, which means that black is going to struggle to get a lot more development. And because of this, Reti comments that white's main plan shouldn't be to try and strike in the center and get a lot of sharp, accurate play from the center. White's better off simply trying to prevent black from being able to get any exchanges, prevent black from being able to get any play on the wings. Because obviously with the center being closed, like black's got a solid center here. This is a very strong center. So black is able to start playing on the wings, just as white could potentially play on the wings as well, because white has the center as well. And white should therefore try and focus on avoiding black from having much opportunities for development. And because of that, bishop g5 is a mistake. What Reti comments is perhaps better is something like a4. And this is because it will prevent a lot of ideas around like b5 and b6, b5 and b4. Whereas this bishop g5 move would give black a bit of activity, a bit of counterplay. So after h6, bishop h4, we see knight to h5. Now white drops the bishop back to g3. We see knight takes g3, h takes g3, and then b5, which is why a4 would have been better to prevent this b5 push. Bishop d3 is played, and now a6 is pushed. And a6 is to protect b5, essentially giving black the opportunity to try and push c5, maybe even c4 later on. And now here, white strikes back with a4. However, bishop b7 comes, and we see how black's starting to gradually get some more space. He's got the strong center, and now he's starting to push on the wings. So we see rook a to d1 next, anticipating the file perhaps opening, and also centralizing the rook, anticipating this file perhaps opening. Queen to c7 is played, and this is sort of setup is very common with the Philidor. You would often have at least a knight on f6, knight on d7, bishop on e7, and a queen on c7. The queen's essentially adding a whole bunch of support to the c5 pawn, just as the knight is, which is why black is able to get their pawns in this e5 d6 setup without ever having to exchange the pawn or risk losing it. Now here white plays a takes b5. Actually, there is a variation which I think we do have to mention. This bishop is obviously running short on squares. If black is able to get a pawn to here, the bishop would potentially be trapped. However, if after e takes d4, knight takes d4, c5, threatening to play c4 with a tempo, this doesn't quite work, because after knight f5, c4, the queen can come to g4, threatening mate, and that gives white just enough time to bring their bishop back. So g6 is forced, and then bishop e2 would then save the bishop, because obviously this pawn is pinned to the king, so it can't take. So the bishop isn't going to end up trapped in that instance. And that's why Nimzowitsch played queen c7 instead of trying to go for that variation. We see a takes b5, a takes b5, and now g4. And white's likely trying to play g2, king g2, rook h1, and then possibly trying to double up the rooks and just trying to control the h file. However, Reti comments that white really needs to try and consolidate the position first. White should try and play something like knight to b1 and push c3, just to try and consolidate their position. They're not ready to try and attack. However, Nimzowitsch, his pieces are, well, his position is a lot more, it's a lot stronger. He's got control of the open file. His pieces aren't quite ready to attack, but after a bit of maneuvering with his pieces, they'll very quickly be able to attack on the king side and the queen side. Now here, Nimzowitsch plays rook f to e8. We see d5. And now b4, attacking the knight. D takes c6, bishop takes c6, knight to b1. And now we see knight to c5. And then knight b to d2. Now queen c8, bishop c4, and now g6. And g6 is essentially the start of trying to prepare to attack the king side. Note that this pawn can't be taken, because after queen takes, bishop takes f7. If king takes f7, then you would lose your queen. And if the king moves, let's say to king h8, well, you lose the rook. I didn't even see I was attacking the rook then. So the queen can't take the pawn because of the threat on the rook. So instead, Nimzowitsch plays g6 to prepare to attack on the king side. We see g3, continuing with the idea of playing king g2 and trying to get the rooks to the h file. King g7, knight h2, bishop to g5. And we can already see, if we go back a few moves, we could sort of see that black's pieces weren't that well placed. But after a few moves, suddenly his pieces are getting more and more active. His position is a lot better than it was just 5 or 6 moves ago. And he's sort of maneuvering his pieces so they're controlling the queen side, they're controlling the king side. He's still got control of the center. And we see how Nimzowitsch is just sort of attacking on both of the wings at the same time. He's not making any direct threats just yet, but he's improving the position of his pieces to control both sides of the board. Here we see f3. Reti comments that if f4, trying to attack the bishop and cut it off, then after e takes f4, g takes f4, bishop f6, we'll see that this pawn is under attack, and this pawn is also under attack. So white wouldn't be able to defend all of the pawns. Which is why we see f3 instead. And now we see queen to c7 by Nimzowitsch, rook f to e1. Now the reason for rook to e1 is if, say, king g2, continuing with white's plan, then knight a4 would come, attacking this pawn, and if white tried to defend the pawn, then we would see bishop takes d2, queen takes d2, bishop takes e4, f takes e4, and then queen takes c4. So we see how we move the defender of this bishop, and then we open the line to the bishop. However, with this rook f to e1, that doesn't quite work, because knight a4, rook to b1, and now if we remove the defender, after bishop takes e4, opening up the attack, rook takes e4, holds everything together. So rook f to e1 allows the recapture of this pawn on e4 to defend the bishop. We now see rook h8, knight d to f1, h5. Essentially, Nimzowitsch is now just trying to break through on the king side. He's got control of the queen side. The centre is fairly even. Arguably, he has better control of the centre, and now he's looking at trying to get control of the king side, which was actually where white was actually trying to play, but wasn't quite active enough. We see g takes h5, rook takes h5, and now bishop to d5, rook a to h8, bishop takes c6, queen takes, queen to c4, queen to b6, and now white plays king to g2, and now we see knight to e6. And with this move, black is now threatening quite a few different combinations. So if we pass the move onto black, the first combination which Reti comments is something like rook takes h2, because after knight takes h2, rook takes h2, king takes, we then have this queen f2 check. And the idea is after king h3, it'll be mate in 4, starting with bishop to f4. Now if you take here, knight takes f4 check, king to g4, queen g2 check, king h4, and then g5 is mate. And if you play rook to g1, trying to defend against the mate threat, then knight g5 is the move given by Reti. And after king h4, you'd have queen h2 check, king g4, and then queen h5 is mate. And likewise, if we played king g4, I don't think we looked at this one yet, then queen takes f3 check will come, defended by the knight, the queen defends the bishop, and the pawn defends the bishop defends the knight, everything's defending each other. And now after king to h4, we have queen h5 mate. So this knight e6 move has quite a lot of threats to it, because it's able to jump to g5 or to f4 if it needs to. And likewise, this bishop and the queen are able to get quite a nice little battery and invade the king side very quickly. So to try and parry that, white plays rook e2, stopping any queen f2 ideas. However, after knight to d4, attacking the rook's forced to retreat back to e1. If it goes to f2, then the rook would be trapped. Obviously you can't take here because of rook takes h2, which would lead to mate actually, because king g1, go to here, you go to here, and that's mate. So the rook is forced to go back to e1, and here Nimzowitsch plays queen to b7, and now the threat is rook to c8, threatening the queen and this c2 pawn, and white doesn't really have any good defense to it. If they play something like c3, after b takes c3, b takes c3, queen to b2 is the move given by Reti, and the idea is after something like king g1 would have knight takes f3 check, king h1, and then rook takes, knight takes, queen takes. And if the knight takes f3, then it will be rook h1 mate. So that's why c3 doesn't quite work, because after the exchanges, queen b2 will come, and then the king has to retreat to here, and it's almost going to be like a ladder mate almost. So c3 doesn't work, and so because of that, white tried sacrificing the exchange and taking on d4. So Nimzowitsch naturally recaptured, he takes d4, and now we see knight to g4. Now we've got two defenders of this h2 square. So white's trying to put up a defense, the best defense he can. Nimzowitsch plays queen to b6, defending everything. We see f4, trying to kick this bishop away. Bishop to e7, rook to d1, and now f5 comes. So attacking a knight and attacking a pawn. The knight retreats to f2. We see f takes e4, and now queen takes d4 check, trying to get a bit of a queen trade, hoping to try and obviously pick up some extra pawns. However, this position is probably already lost for white. White's down in exchange, and just looking at the computer valuation, it's -3. And we'll see a few extra moves as to how Nimzowitsch is able to clean up. So he plays d5, simply defending the pawn, defended by the rook. This one's defended by the bishop. You see g4, trying to push the rook away from the defense of the pawn. Bishop to c5, rook to d1, and now rook to h4. So now after rook takes d5, bishop takes f2, moving the defender of this pawn. King takes, rook takes g4. We see that black has managed to exchange pawns. White hasn't managed to capture any pawns. It's always been an exchange 1 for 1, 1 for 1. Now we see king to e3, rook to c8, king takes e4, rook c4 check, king to d3, and now rook c takes f4. And this is where the comments of this is where the game ends in the book. The game did continue on, and I might have a quick look at it. But Reti comments that we see now that we see black strategy in this Han-Ham defense. It's very similar to the Steinitz formation in the Roy Lopez that we saw a lot of with the Steinitz games, where you make that secure center. You get the center very strong. The Steinitz defense the Steinitz variation is perhaps a bit better because the bishop's outside the pawn chain. But you get that strong attacking formation, and then you get that strong central formation, which allows you to start attacking on either wing. And we saw quite just how Nimzowitsch did that, how he gained control of the queen side, and then he gained control of the king side, and he was able to eventually force white to give up in the exchange, leading to a winning endgame. Now the remaining moves I won't offer any analysis for, but I will quickly go through. I don't want to offer analysis simply because Reti hasn't offered an analysis. But the remaining moves were knight e3, obviously attacking the rook to g3, pinning the knight, rook e5, king f6, rook to e8, we see king f7, rook e5, rook f6, c4 is played, b3, king e4, rook e6, so rook takes e6, king takes e6, knight to d5, g5. And this is where white resigned. It's fairly clear with the rook and the centralized king. I'm assuming white just didn't see any way possible of stopping this pawn from queening. The king can't go to here. They can't go to here. The only move the king has is king d4, which is the computer's top choice, giving it to minus 8.3 to black. King d4 is the computer's move, and it's fairly clear that white would just be unable to stop this g4 pawn. They might have to give up the knight for it, in which case it'll be a rook and king, a rook, king and pawn, versus king and 2 pawns, which is quite easily winning for black. Well, it does need a bit of technique, but someone like Nimzowitsch would win it easily. And so there we have it. That was game number 44, the second game of Nimzowitsch, and it was looking at the Philidor defense. Frustratingly, I'd actually just played a tournament game where my opponent played a variation of the Philidor, so sort of wish I saw this game first. But this is the Philidor defense. I hope you liked the game. If you do, please like, comment and subscribe, and I hope to see you next time. Thank you for watching.